Hi, welcome to English with Miss Marshall. I'm recording the lessons here because I can't be with you in person every lesson, and so this is the next best thing that I've come up with. Today we're going to be talking about unfamiliar text, and unfamiliar text is one of the exams that you do at the end of the year. It's one of two exams. In the unfamiliar text exam, they give you a passage that you haven't seen before, and you're expected to make some sort of sentence out of it and explain what the author is doing and how they are doing that. It can be a bit daunting to start off with, so what I thought we'd do today is that I'd give you a sample of the exam. It's not the whole exam, just to try to start to look at what it is and unpacking it, figuring out how to approach these things. And then as we go throughout the year, there'll be lots of little practices as do nows that aren't anywhere near the length of the exam, but things to keep things like language features and parts of speech and that fun stuff fresh in your brain. Without further ado, let's move on to unfamiliar text. So my slides are designed to follow the handout that you should have in front of you, hopefully. If not, now would be a great time to sort that out. Pen and paper would be really handy, or pen and the handout would be really handy to have, so you can make notes, so you can attempt the work on your own as we go through this. So what is unfamiliar text? Like I said before, unfamiliar text asks you to look at writing that is unfamiliar to you. That is, that you haven't seen it before. It's not a text that you've studied. It's not a book that you've read in class and you've kind of gone over everything about it. And to make meaning out of it. It's also called close reading. So we do close viewing as a class. We will be doing that slightly later on. This is close reading. It's taking a passage that you haven't seen and figuring out what the author is doing. This means that you need to consider things like the audience. That's who is the text created for. What is the ideal reader of the text that the author specifically had in mind when they wrote it? That doesn't mean that it's anybody who reads it. That's what a lot of people tend to default to, but that's not what it is. When you sit down to write a letter, for example, you're writing it to a person, or sometimes if it's an open letter or a letter to, say, the editor of a newspaper, you still have a readership in mind. It's the people who read that newspaper. It's the people that you may be trying to address to action some change. The same is true for all texts. Everybody has an ideal reader in their mind. That includes an age group. It includes demographics, such as where they might live, what they're interested in, and those things. So narrow down your audience. Who is that ideal reader, that perfect reader in mind that the author has in mind? Purpose is, why was the text written? There's some broad purposes we will cover at a later date in many different ways, but in general, things like to entertain, or to inform, or to argue, to persuade. All of those are really big purposes. They're broad purposes, but they actually work, and they tend to encapsulate why most texts were written. And of course, there can be more specific purposes as well, but we'll worry about that later. Feeling. How does the author use the text to manipulate your emotions, if they do at all? And that depends on the text, of course. Some texts, like poetry, are specifically designed to wring your heart a little bit, to make you feel one way or the other with the power of the words. And other texts really aren't. They're just designed to inform you, and you don't necessarily leave feeling any different for having read the text. But that's an important thing to consider when you're tackling unfamiliar text. And how does the author achieve their purpose? How do they actually get it done? And this is where it comes down to kind of the nitty-gritty things, and these are all really important to know because that's what you use to break down the text. That's things like language features, which is the same thing as figurative language. It's just a different way of saying it. It's things like tone, style, implications. What is implications is like, what is the author not saying that they could be saying? Or what is the author implying? What are they saying without saying? Reading between the lines. That becomes really important with unfamiliar texts. So what I want you to do, this is where your task comes in. You are doing a sample unfamiliar text piece. On the following slide, there is a passage of text that was taken from a previous practice exam, not an actual exam, so you can't find them on the NCEA website. It's just a different resource I had in my hand. Your task is to attempt to answer the question as outlined in the exam, starting at part A and moving to part B. And this is, even though it's a practice exam, designed to very much model the way the exam works. It's in the same formatting. I think it's even down to like the same fonts. It's designed to look identical because that's part of the point of a practice exam, is to not just have it for derived grade purposes, but also to have it so you get a practice. You are comfortable when you come to sit the real exam, particularly at level 1 where you haven't done this before. It's all new and strange and rather intimidating. Now note that all of the language features, all of them in the little boxes and techniques that are noted in the tick box option of part A, are in the selected passage. That means there's no trick questions. They're not waiting for you to tick one and then be, aha, that's not in there. That's not their job. They want to make it as easy as possible for you to do the exam and for you to pass the exam. So your job then is to find one of these that you understand and can identify, and then quote that line from the passage where it says, give an example of the language feature from the text. Don't write your own because you're trying to prove that you know what a simile is, so you're creating your own simile. No, go back and find the simile in that piece and just quote it. Just write the line it is. If it's a very long sentence, you don't have to have the whole sentence. Just include the bit that has that language feature. If it's something like a noun or a verb and that's what you've ticked, then underline which one it is so we know. If you've included a passage, we don't know you know which is the noun or which is the verb that you want to point out. So make sure you underline really specific stuff like that to tell the person that's marking your exam, yes, I know what I'm on about, because that's what we're looking for. That proves that you know what the language feature is and that you're not just guessing. It's not just, well, I'll tick this one because it looks pretty. And part B wants you to explain how that language feature, as well as any others you can identify, work to achieve the purpose of the text. They do give you some hints of where to go from that. Now, for the part B specifically, you can start with the same language feature as it says. You can also use another language feature. If the first thing that jumped out at you was a simile and you've quoted it, but then you decide that simile is not useful for tackling what it wants you to explain in part B, then go with something else. That's absolutely fine. That's why the wording of it says this and or others. They do want you to talk about language features there, but they want you to talk about how those language features helped you understand something. So it's not a shopping list of language features of everything that you could find. It's not a, well, you found 10 different language features, so you get 10 points, and somebody who found 5 only gets 5. Ideally, you really only need 2 or 3 per text that you find, but you need to be able to explain them. Just like in your junior work, we're really looking for the explanation in a tease type paragraph. And if you can have 2 examples that work towards the one purpose, that's fantastic. If you need a couple different examples that kind of do different things within the text for an overall meaning, that's fine too. The ideal answer here is 2 to 3 paragraphs at most, not more than that. If you write more than that, you're writing too much. 1 paragraph at a bare minimum, can cut it depending on what you say. It's quality over quantity. I've seen some excellence level answers that only take up maybe half the page, and then I've seen some not achieved that took up every space given to them. So remember, it's really about what you say, not about how many words you use to say it or how much you ramble on. So for now, what I'd like you to do is pause this video, take some time to work out, look at the text piece, work out what it's doing, how it's doing it, see if you can find those language features, see if you can start to break down some of the audience and purpose type things, why it's doing what it's doing, and then we're going to come back to this. So just pause me here, and we'll come back when you're done. This is the text you were given. It's text A out of A, B, and C because there are 3 different texts in the exam. I only wanted you to look at the first one. This text is about a girl who struggles with her sense of direction. Now note that this is something you've been given that's not part of the actual text. It's explaining a little bit what's going on because it's taken from a larger piece. So, the Field Guide for Lost Girls. My grandfather said that I fell straight as a plumb bob from the tree. For a while he knelt beside my still body, picking off snapped branches and leaves. The sun climbed higher over the hills. When I finally came around, Grandfather said he wasn't sure if it was him or me who was saved. He measured the circumference of my head, traced calipers between my brows, collected my tears. He was pretty sure something had been knocked out of me. Sure enough, it proved to be geography. The maps, the south from the north, the east from the west, the follow your nose, the straight as a crow flies, the retrace your steps, and the sun always sets. We never spoke of it. When I got lost crossing the street or made the wrong turn going out of the kitchen door, the adults just smiled indulgently. But as I got older, I began to find little notes stuffed in my school backpack, in the pocket of my jacket, in the zippered compartment of my bag. Turn left at the gate until you get to a right-hand turn. Follow the seaward route. Mark your distance on the grid. And then there was this one, the one I still carry when walking the streets of strange cities, the one that keeps me from feeling lost. I can just make out Grandfather's writing beside the X. You are here. So when it comes to unpacking it, they give you some glossary or glossed words to start, which I didn't go over at the beginning. Starting with plumb bob, which was in the first sentence. And it's a usually small, heavy object that is used to make a string or a rope hang straight. It's kind of like a necklace, but it's not used around the neck as such. It's used to see something hanging straight, to see straight up and down using gravity, and it's got a weight at the end. So it looks like a necklace, it's just not worn like a necklace. Calipers are measuring instruments used to measure diameter or thickness. They're like pinching motion. Straight as the crow flies is an expression which you may or may not have heard, and that means going directly to a destination without regard for obstacles. So the distance between, say, your house and school, straight as the crow flies, if you were going overhead, might be 1, but if you have to follow the roads, it could be significantly longer. The other thing that they give you is the source, and every exam will do this, every practice exam will do this, because that way it's not plagiarism. And the source here is Frankie McMillan, so this tells us the author of the piece. And from there we can start to get a sense whether it's the author was boy or girl, assuming gender here. My Mother and the Hungarians, which is the larger book that it came from, and the Field Guide for Lost Girls. So this is possibly a short story or a chapter within that called the Field Guide for Lost Girls, and that's just where it is published. So we know it's a New Zealand text. And we also know that we can assume that the narrator, which is not necessarily the author, but in this case likely is female, simply because it's a field guide for lost girls. Titles and such are really important to pay attention to with unfamiliar text, because you can get a lot of really good information there. So carrying on. The questions you are given. Question 1, refer to the text A, the Field Guide for Lost Girls, on page 2 of the resource booklet. And then you select or tick one language feature that the writer uses to communicate an event in the narrator's life. There's simile, cliche, verbs, contrast, listing, imperative, punctuation, simple sentences, structure, and alliteration. And then give an example of that language feature from the text. And part B is explain how this and or other language features helps us understand the girl's character. You might consider the way the girl explains how she came to be as she is, and the relationship between the girl and her grandfather. Just give me a moment to take a drink. So carrying on from there. I did say at the beginning, and I wasn't lying, that all of these are in there. So what can we find? What can we find and where can we find it? I'll just go to this mode for a little bit so you can kind of get a sense for what we're doing. Now, this is really handy to follow along on paper because I realize it's probably a bit hard to see, but there's an easy way to kind of do this aside from the way I'm doing it. So, simile. We know what a simile is, right? It's using like or as to make a comparison. And there is one in that very first sentence. So, my grandfather said I fell straight as a plumb bob from the tree. Straight as a plumb bob, right in there. That's a simile. So we could highlight that. If you have your own highlighter, feel free to mark up your text that you're given, the paper. And that's true for the exam too. You can bring in highlighters, you could circle, underline, you can write all over this. Because that's part of how you start making things pop out for yourself. Excuse me. What else do we see? So there's a simile. Do we see any other similes? Possibly. We've got straight as a crow flies. That's simile. Does it add to the meaning? Maybe, maybe not. It's not COVID, I promise. So those are the two that pop out to me. That's not to say that there's not more. I haven't got a cheat sheet in front of me that would tell me that I've gone over prior to this. I have looked at the text before, but I haven't marked it up because I wanted to do this with you so you can kind of understand the feeling of it. So you could choose either of those if you're choosing simile. Cliche. Now, what is a cliche? It's not a cliché, it's a cliche. That's why there's an accent on the E. A cliche is an expression that is used a whole lot, that maybe is overused or that it's kind of old now. Common sayings become cliches. So what would count as a cliche here? Honestly, for you guys, cliches are really hard because you haven't been around a whole long time to know what is like almost trite because it's overused too much. But if you've heard the expression before, especially at your age, it's probably a cliche. So where I wouldn't consider straight as a plumb bob part of a cliche, I would possibly consider straight as a crow flies. Because as I said, that's really common expression that we kind of use. Follow your nose could also be called a cliche, and depending on how you want to argue it, possibly even you are here. With things like cliche and anything else, if you don't understand what it is here and you're not confident that you know what it is and can find it and give an example, don't choose that. It's part of why they give you, in this case, 10 different examples. Because they know some of those are going to be over your head. They're just like, I don't understand what that's talking about. I don't know what that is. How am I supposed to do this? You're supposed to do it by finding what you do know. It's not designed to show you what you don't know, just what you do. So what else can we find? Verbs. All of these sentences will have verbs. So why would they put that on there? They put that on there specifically because, not just to give you the most chance they can, but also because what stands out to you? Maybe something specifically does about that verb. Same if they put adjectives or something like that on there. Any parts of speech that they put, what about that particular part of a speech really resonates with you and really makes you think, ah. So if I was to talk about a verb, again, there's going to be one in every sentence, but You are here. Are is a verb. It's a to be verb. It's what we call an auxiliary verb. However, it has really big impact in that sentence because it's you are here. Now, she's got the note in her pocket. She carries it everywhere with her, so where here is would be changing all the time. But she is there. It kind of has a wider meaning, if you will, that you can expand on if you wanted to. If you wanted to talk about that in part B, for example. Contrast. What is contrast? Contrast is things that are opposite to each other or standing out from each other. Where is contrast in here? We've got lots of similarities with the listing, which is there. So all of this be listing, and I know I'm jumping ahead, so apologies for that. Make it pale pink. So there will be a contrast in here. I'm struggling right at the moment to find an obvious example of it. So again, you can't find it, you don't know what they're on about, skip it. We've talked about listing. Imperative. What is an imperative? Remember? An imperative is something that tells you what you're to do. So if I say stand up, sit down, go over there, those are all imperatives. They are commands. They're directions. Imperative. Turn left at the gate until you get to a right-hand turn. That's an imperative. All of those directions that he gives, those are imperatives. Why is that important to the text? There's lots of ways you can expand on why that's important. And you can make very valid arguments. As with everything in English, you can say anything you want. And as long as you back up what you say, that'll do. So you can say anything you want as long as you know what the heck it is you're talking about and you're prepared to make an argument about it. Argument as in persuasive, not as in confrontation or fighting about it. Carrying on, punctuation. Again, this is another one that obviously there's punctuation. It's not just a stream with no punctuation at all, like some of you write. It's punctuation for a purpose. Punctuation that stands out. I might say things like that could be maybe commented on. I don't find punctuation super interesting to talk about because it's just there. It's just everywhere. Unless they do something really new and different with punctuation. Simple sentences. What is a simple sentence? It's a straightforward sentence with no clauses, with no commas. Has a comma, it's not a simple sentence. This is a simple sentence, and it's also the last sentence, so that probably means it's pretty important. Especially the way it stands on its own. It's not just a simple sentence, it's also a paragraph all by itself. Great thing to talk about. Why have they ended the piece here? Why is that on its own there? What is the meaning of that? There's so much you can use from simple sentences if you quote that. So go with you are here if you want simple sentence. It won't be the only one in there, of course, but it's a pretty powerful one. And powerful is great when you're doing these things. So I've highlighted that for that. Structure is how the author structures it. So again, you could talk about you are here for the structure. It's on its own. It's a really interesting one to give a short example of that fits in that space. But that's what it is. And alliteration. Do we remember what alliteration is? Where can we find alliteration here? I got lost crossing the street. Began to find little notes. Here's a little bit stuffed in my school backpack. It's not very big because, again, alliteration is that starting sound. It's not a very big example. There's Streets of Strange Cities. This is a good example of alliteration. Keep in mind, while cities starts with a C, it is pronounced like an S in this instance. That is all alliteration. And that's a good example of it. So why has she used Streets of Strange Cities like that? It'll have something to do with how it sounds. It has something to do with how you feel as she's walking on it, walking the streets of strange cities. It's kind of got a rhythm to it. That's alliteration. And those are the examples there. Again, there will be more of them. There will absolutely be more of them. If you found something that you're like, but Miss hasn't commented on it, it must be wrong. Is it? How do you know? I haven't pointed them all out, so it might well not be wrong. And there's other techniques that aren't one of these 10 that the author will also be using. So what I want to look at for this part, what can we find off the bat, straight off the bat? This helps us start breaking down that text. How does each part that we've highlighted, how does it work together to form that whole, to make overall meaning? What is the author's purpose for the overall text? And how do these little bits contribute? So now that you're starting to look at part B, which is explain how this and or other language features help us understand the girl's character, you can consider the way the girl explains how she came to be as she is, with a relationship between her and her grandfather. That's your starting point. Start with the bits that you've highlighted or made note of or underlined, and so on. I think some of the copies I gave out are already underlined. That's fine too. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to end this video now because it's getting a little bit long and it might need to carry over 2 lessons, which is fine. It's fantastic. And come back for part 2 for we're talking about part B.